Yeah, I'm okay. Okay, basic composition. So I'm trying to use a bit of wet and dry going on here too. So in this area here, you can see where the brush is much drier, and you get a lot of white showing. That's called flying white. That's the term that's being used there. All right, let's mix up some color. So every type of paint has a medium, a glue, that holds the pigment together and onto the paper or to the canvas. You know, with oil painting, it's linseed oil. With Western watercolors, whether it's gouache or watercolor, it's gum arabic. But in Chinese painting, it's traditionally was a deer antler glue. Now it's a synthetic. But the point is that when it dries and you get it wet again, it doesn't run. That's the main difference. Because if all the pieces of mine that you see off to the side here under Mylar, they've all been mounted. In other words, another sheet of paper has been glued onto the back with wheat starch. And the entire painting gets completely saturated. So your colors can't run. Otherwise, it ruins. The reds have a tendency to run, but you can do things to sort of mitigate that. So the blossoms here for red plum. It's a combination of, it's really a light orange and rouge is the color in Chinese. What I'm doing is I'm keeping the brush wet. It's a very soft sheep hair brush, and the color is just at the tip. And when I put the color down, the idea is that when you lay the belly of the brush against the paper, the color will run. So the color actually mixes on the paper as you paint. There are some schools of painting where they'll put 3 or 4 colors on the brush at once and then work with it. That's a little... that's one of the reasons I like the freehand approach, the Shei style of painting. It's usually very direct. Color is certainly welcome, but it's more about the brushwork. Plum blossoms are very similar to cherry blossoms. It's five petals. Right. The term is Chinese watercolor. Yeah. The main company that sells them is just called Marie's. They also make Western watercolors, so if you're buying the paints, just be sure it says Chinese watercolors. Right. It's very similar to gouache. I use gouache sometimes, and then I add my own Chinese medium to it to help it work with the rice paper.
Could you use Western watercolors?
On rice paper, Western watercolors come out looking a little bit anemic. So this has a little body to it. So that is a special skill, it's true. And one of the reasons I'm doing a plant today, you know, the three friends of winter, as opposed to, say, landscape. Landscape tends to take longer. You work on it in layers for the most part. It's a different approach. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. Yeah. No. Once it dries, it's there forever. Like it or not. And it's incredible how black it is. It's all, when it dries and you grind out the, well, if you grind your own, that's one thing. But when you buy it, you know, pure black, when it dries, it's almost glossy. That's how thick it is. I don't typically. You don't really need to. Some people do. They like the practice. They like the meditation of it, the tradition of it.
Is this your own composition, or is this a standard one that...
It's inspired by somebody else's work, but I did my own riff on it. Okay. And then the standard green is usually just yellow, gamboge yellow, with a tiny bit of indigo or cyan. You know, if it's a very yellow green, it's generally referred to as a young green, meaning like an early spring green, as opposed to an old green, which is bluer. And if you have any questions while I'm working, I can't see you and paint at the same time, but if you have a question, just shout it out. Tiny bit of green in the middle there. We do the sepals, those tiny little leaves that sort of hug the flower or the bud. The plum, pine, and bamboo. Yes. Yeah. You don't always see them painted together, but individually and collectively, they're a popular winter theme. Sorry? Yes. In fact, off to the side, I have I'll drag it over in a bit. Yeah. Because bamboo and snow is really pretty. And it's fun to do. So occasionally, you know, you can use, like for snow, you can use white pigment. I know in traditional Western watercolor, you sort of shy away from white pigment. In Chinese painting, it's not that big a deal. You don't use it like whiteout, but you know, you can use it like a color occasionally. I'll bring the other one over in a bit. I can talk about it. There's a couple of approaches you can take. You can just simply use the white of the paper and paint around it and leave those areas blank, which takes a lot of planning. Or you can apply white or do, you know, any combination of the above.
think of the paints as being opaque or transparent?
Good question. I use both. I use them as both.
How much water you've got next to it?
Yeah. Yeah, it really depends on the piece. I'm looking off to the side. Right in the center is a very blue, misty piece you can look at. That's got a lot of opaque color just floating around on top. And even these blossoms are pretty opaque. You know, it's pretty rich. You know, what's going on there. Just putting in different textures, working up the texture for the bark and the little buds that are growing. All of which gives me a little extra time to let the blossoms dry a little bit. So when I put in the stamens, it doesn't run.
You always put out fresh paint.
Yes, because this is a liquid in a tube as opposed to a cake. And if it dries, you can just reuse it. Ink is another matter. When ink dries, it doesn't, if you mix it up, it still is very grainy. Some people like to use that, and then they use that, it's called overnight ink, because it's very flat and somewhat granular, and they'll mix that in with the other ink, just for effect. Yeah, overnight ink. There's all sorts of tricks you can do with this sort of work, and especially because this paper is so thin. So if we're doing a landscape, and I want a really rich color, but I don't want to cover the ink, you can actually put the color in from the back. So, yeah. So you do the transparency on front, and then some more opaque color on the back, and that richness really comes through without blotting out your initial ink. Yeah. Back it with another sheet of paper. Yeah, and that's glued on. Yeah, I've learned to do that myself. There's a learning curve. Small pieces are not that hard, but if you're mounting your own 27 by 36 inch piece, and the extra piece of the paper is 4 inches bigger on all sides, and it's all soaking wet, it's just a little daunting. I mount it onto, typically I use mulberry paper because it's really strong.
Did you say you use some kind of special glue?
Wheat starch. Sorry, right now I'm mixing up just very dark burgundy just for the center of each flower. And it's just a dot. Just a little dot. The stamens will come out of that. Schwen? Yeah, there's a few spellings on it because there's a couple of different. Typically it's spelled X-U-A-N. But the old spelling is S-H-U-E-N. I think that's right.
I'm sorry, what is it? Spelling
It's the type of paper I'm using. Schwen, like the old bicycle. That's what it sounds like. Bicycle we had as kids. Some of us.
Is that a sized paper or unsized paper?
This is unsized. You can also get sized Schwen or even semi-sized. I tend to work pretty quickly, just generally speaking. And this is a really nice sort of simplified subject that you can put down rather quickly as well. So I think we'll have time to do, we'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll do a separate painting for each subject. So there's a couple approaches for color for red plum. A lot of times it's just simply red, and then the stamens are done in black. Very simple. Another version is a little green center, white stamens, and then the yellow tips to the stamens themselves.
That's convention. That's just
Yeah,
acceptable.
yeah. There's a few different approaches there. It's basically different schools. There's the Lingnan school of painting, which I think of as the new school. It's sort of began in the 18th century. And they employed a lot of Western and Japanese painting influence. So it's a lot more decorative, a lot more color. Technically very demanding, actually, not easy. And that's when you usually see a lot of color. But the really traditional approach to red plum, you'll see just ink with red and black. That's it. Okay. My students laughed at me. I use an old white sock to absorb extra. I just threw out one that was just cold black from years and years of use. Not really, no. I don't get sentimental about that stuff. So much of, thank you by the way, so much of Chinese painting is suggesting more than what you've actually painted, you know. Keep it simple, keep it direct, keep it strong, and, you know, and so much of the brushwork is inspired, and the aesthetic of it, the appreciation of it is inspired by the appreciation of Chinese calligraphy. So I like to, you know, leave that part of it, you know, pretty obvious and straightforward. And then when that dries, well, just with your hands, you can brush it off and get rid of that charcoal that's lingering. You know, sign it and seal it somewhere, you know, down at the bottom here. And I think that gives you the idea of plum blossoms, right? Let's do pines. Wash out my brushes a bit.
So what if you do a random hand motion and you accidentally put a brush stroke where you don't want it?
There's a couple things. You can work with it. You can start again. The paper's not that expensive. You can start again. Just depends depends what you want to do. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the times there's all different approaches to painting. I'll do, I don't think I have an example here. Oh, I do. I'll bring it over. Let's talk about that a little bit.
I have the big up on the screen now, Gary, so if you want to hold it up and show the people that'll work good.
Hold it up, pointing where?
I guess it doesn't work so well. Okay, I'll go back and put it in.
Okay. This has Mylar on it, so I'm not sure if you're going to get a lot of glare. It's all right? All right. I'm going to need more water in a minute, but that's all right. Oh, so sometimes, if I don't really have a idea what I'm doing for a composition, you can just do monoprints, abstract monoprints. Color, a little bit of ink, take a piece of plexiglass, light sandpaper, like a fine sandpaper, so that the water doesn't beat up too much. And then you can just put ink and colors down, put paper on top, see what you get. Maybe it looks like a landscape, maybe it doesn't. Do a dozen of those and play with them, see what you can do. So that's how this painting came about. And leaving a lot of it, not really trying to explain all of it, just putting in enough information there so that the imagination sort of fills in the gaps. That was but that's kind of fun for me to do, especially if you're starting, a whole new bunch of ideas. So with snow, so we just did this a couple weeks ago in my class. So this is bamboo and with snow under the moon. Yeah. Yeah. So with Schwinn, actually, we painted the blue from the back. So the very first thing we did to bring you through it, and I'll do bamboo in a little while, stalks go in, the leaves go in, everything just in ink, no color at that point, let it completely dry, and then use whatever you want to use for a stencil. I was actually using a paper coffee cup because it was the right size. Figured out where I wanted the moon, put the cup down, and then paint around it with color. Get the paper a little wet first so that it bleeds. That way you don't see too many brush strokes. Using a thick, like a hockey brush, I don't know if you've seen this. And then, being very more careful around the circle itself. And when that dries, actually you don't have to wait till it's completely dry. And then at that point with white paint, you can start putting in the snow. Just paint the snow in where you would assume it would be. So it's highly stylized, but the overall impression it gives off, I think, is, this sort of lovely, quiet, romantic scene, right? That's the approach. That's the hope. The hope. Can I get water?
This one's clean.
Oh.
I'll take the dirty one.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
You spend a lot of time, I would think, the brush strokes and how you're using the brush, so
Yeah, I painted for a while, so I don't always think about how I paint. It's just, a lot of it is just practice at this point. Yes. So the typical position for holding a brush is upright, which seems really awkward when you start. Your wrist is down, the hand is up, right? It's a 3-finger hold, so you can twist the brush. Because sometimes the brush is doing this, you're pushing, you're doing all sorts of things with it. And like any drawing, really, for the most part, you're drawing, especially, I don't know if you're able to see, but in painting the ink work here for the branches, it's not little strokes with the wrist. It's all arm. It's all from the shoulder. When I do the pine needles in particular, even though they're little straight lines, it's not wrist. It's all arm. So it seems quite energetic, and that's what's referred to when they talk about the bone stroke. I can actually demo that. So bone stroke is exactly what it sounds like. With Schwinn, not really so much. With mulberry, yeah. Yeah, and some people like to work on the back if they like that texture. So I don't do Chinese calligraphy, but we'll see if I can fake it. So everything that you touch onto the paper is going to show. There's no holding lines, so you have to hit it with confidence. Everything shows, everything has to count. Every line has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Example of that is the bone stroke. It starts, and it's a calligraphic stroke. Let me flip this around. Brush goes down. There's a pause. It heads off to my left, stretches to the right, stops, and then circles back on itself to come back. So it's supposed to depict, the chi, that stretch, that life force, right? You're actually using the chi in yourself to paint something, and it's visible on paper. So it has a stretch to it, and it's not a straight line. You know, a straight line vertically across, or rather horizontally across, I'm sorry, is the number 1 in Chinese. You know, but it's not a ruler straight. You know, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's the bone stroke. That's kind of the heart and soul of Chinese aesthetics of painting, or at least for brushwork. It doesn't mean that every stroke has this, but that everything you put down on paper has intention. It has strength to it. So if I'm feeling tentative about the work, when I'm painting a plum branch, for example, that branch is going to look weak. I need it to feel strong. So, pine trees. So I'm going to do a little demo for pine needles to start off with, and I'll do a pine branch. So pine needles, you know, if you look at the actual, you know, say a close-up, you know, you've got, I don't know the terminology for the plant, but you have that main stem, and the needles come off of that. So, you know, you have the main branch that comes down, and then there are these stems that come up, and off of that are the needles. And what that is further down the branch is old growth and then newer growth at the tip. Old growth and newer growth. Now, if you're painting a close-up of a tree, you know, to paint each of these needles individually, it's just confusion. You know, and this is the sort of, especially with rice paper, things get confusing and muddy very quickly. So you really just simplify things down to the sense of a pattern, but it's a pattern that you bring a certain organic element to it, that it's not completely an orderly wallpaper pattern. Right? So instead, so if you think of the needles, and think of that bone stroke while I'm making these needles, right? So they have a little dot at the end. That's just the absorbency of the paper. But what it's showing you is the strength of those needles. They should feel strong, like little iron rods. So that's essentially the pattern. But you squish them together. So it's much tighter and much denser. And that's how you build up a sense of massing with those pine needles. Somewhere I've got a little sketch. It's like a confidence builder, just visually being able to see that. We're all visual people here. So to be able to have that handy to look at is always helpful. No. Sometimes I'll sketch from life, and then I'll work from the sketches, but then when it comes to the painting, it's better to put the photographs aside, you know. You can work, you know, the Chinese have an expression, if you paint from life, you put in too much detail. If you paint only from memory, there's not enough detail. So you try to hit that balance. You know, I try to have my work look almost to have a plein air quality to it, have that sense of immediacy to it. But it's almost never done directly from life. You know, I will work from photographs, I will sketch on site, but then I go back to the studio and work there because it's a translation of what I'm seeing. Let's see. This can be done entirely in black and white, but I'm going to add some color because it's a well, there's something else to show you there. It's a way of kind of double loading the brush. We'll load it with green and with black. Then as I start off painting in black, basically the green comes down and it transfers to a green. Can you see me mixing the color? Oh, good. Good. Yeah, whatever green you like. Pretty young. A little bluer than what we had for the pine. I'm going to add a tiny bit of black to it, just to give it a little more tone.
You always mix your greens?
Yes. Typically greens that are in tubes are much too blue for nature's greens, for my taste. So now, I don't know if you can see it. Anyway, there's green on the brush, but just the tip I have some black. This one's black. I don't know if you can see it, but this one is starting to look a little greener. Like I said, it's all arm and muscle memory at this point.
Are you using your pinky to keep the brush at a certain height?
Yes, it help. That way I know where the paper is. That's just me. It works for me, so I do it. I've met a couple other people that paint like that too, but it's not typically done. No, it's perfectly fine. I don't know, if I was doing Chinese calligraphy, they would probably tell me to cut that out, you know. But as a painter, it's okay. Quite frankly, I think it's whatever works. So I want the darker ones near the bottom, and then the lighter green ones a little further up.
What if I were to really zoom the camera a moment and try to see if we can see that better?
Yeah, sounds good.
Unfortunately, our remote died years ago.
You are the remote.
I'm very remote. Can you move it?
A little to the right?
I think you just move it. Oh, the wrong direction. Yeah, move it to the right so that the black-green needles are under. Okay,
That's
well,
good, we can do that.
I guess that doesn't show much. Does everybody see that at all?
A little better?
Yeah.
Okay. During the break, you can come over and see it personally. You'll have to take my word for it. Yeah, you can do them completely in a round, you know, or whatever you want to do. Yeah, this is just my personal choice, how I work. So for me, this is a black pine. In my imagination, this is a black pine. You know, white pines have a much softer, longer sort of leaves, needles rather. Okay. So I'm working with a dry brush now, pure black. I've pounced the tip of it to split it. We'll be doing the texture for the pine. Just to suggest a bit. Here we go. I want to bring a greater sense of massing to these needles. So I'm going to do a light wash of pale blue-green over the top of that. Because this paper is so absorbent, I can just sort of dot the center of each group of needles and then keep adding water to it so that it spreads. Then you want these circles, as it were, these soft areas to bleed into one another to give her a better sense of massing. Different artists work in different ways. Some will go back over the needles with a very pale ink, redrawing that. That's another approach. So your basic pine branch. That gives you an idea of how that's done. It's going on about 8 o'clock now. Why don't we take our break now? All right, we're back. So we're going to introduce you to the third friend of winter, which is bamboo. So the stalks of bamboo are relatively easy. And it's, the flying white that I talked about earlier, that's where this comes in really handy. Sorry, just trying to, for the stalks, you don't want a brush that's too wet. Sort of bleeding off a lot of the ink. Oop. Don't wreck the place. Okay. So the stalk is basically, everybody has a general idea what bamboo looks like. What we want to do is overemphasize the knuckles, the joints for the bamboo at each spot. When you look at them live on the plant, they're not really that big, but we draw them bigger to give a sense of strength to the plant, because typically those stalks are quite thin, but really, really strong. So there's a, like the bone stroke, there's a little pause at the beginning, a stretch, and then a conclusion, and then we leave a gap, and the imagination sort of attaches everything. So that's the stalk. If you're lucky, you get a little bit of flying white in there, because that stretched out line adds some texture and adds a sense of strength to it. And then what you have connecting them in a darker tone is actually what I call a frown, a dot with a frown. The Chinese actually, it's part of a calligraphic stroke that has two dots in it. So in Chinese calligraphy, you have the character for heart. So at the end here, these are actually two dots connected. So to draw it again, these two dots at the last bit of it right there. Typically they're done, but they're done quickly, so there's a little line that connects them. That part of that character is what you put in between the knuckles of the bamboo. Now the leaves, like we were saying earlier, a lot of Chinese painting is finding the patterns in nature and then simplifying it and then doing variations on those patterns. So I actually went and bought a miniature, what's called a clumping bamboo that doesn't spread. I have it in a pot at home. It's 2 feet tall, so I can study the plant because it's kind of complex and it doesn't look like anything else. But they're very interesting. The leaves also, they're very thin but rather tough. A grouping of 5 leaves, which is quite typical. A lot of times the Chinese will talk about that as looking like a flying swallow. So you have the head, the tail, and the wings. If it's late in the season, if it's during rain, then those wings droop down more. This would be on a vibrant young plant, as you see it here. And it can be facing to the left, it can be facing to the right, and you can do 100 variations on that. Let's go ahead and do a few stalks so we can really look at it here. And using the other principle of just having a light ink on the brush. And this brush I'm using is called a mouse whisker brush, or a rat whisker brush. No rats were harmed. It's just to give you an idea of the sort of strength of that bristle. But I've got gray ink on there now, in other words, quite dilute. But just the tip, I'm working some black into it. That way, as I work, it'll go from black to a lighter gray. So the strokes themselves, to bring back my sample paper, people talk about, the analogy I use is like a plane coming in for a landing, a small one-prop plane coming in for a landing, hitting the landing and then taking off again. That's sort of the motion that you come in. You're making this sort of ellipse. So as the brush comes in, it lands, there's a pull, and then a lift. A lot of times people start off and do that. It's not a flick. The Chinese will talk about it, bamboo as being swords and daggers, because they should have that sense of strength, but also the shape of them. So the comes in, there's a pull, and then a lift.
So it seems to me that you prepare and then you execute. And you're not, there's no ums and ahs when you're making a cluster of leaves or a leaf.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing the whole thing in one step.
Yeah, yeah. And then as the bamboo goes up, on one side, just above the knot, is where the growth will start off for the leaves. On the next knot, it's on the opposite side. It keeps alternating. But the leaves can be groups of 1s, 2s, 3s, 5s. Each leaf is a little different length than others. The leading ones that are older tend to be a little longer. It's a really interesting plant. So those connecting stems, you don't have to explain everything, visually, as long as you explain enough that it makes sense. So those, for me, are and you'll see what I mean. So when I'm connecting those stems. A little is enough. Now with younger plants that are growing, the leaves will actually point up. We'll go back to a sample. So if we have just a stem coming up, and you're talking about patterns, so if we have 2 leaves coming off of that, that's called a fishtail. Sometimes it's a double fishtail. Right? The stem comes up, and there's a group of 3, and it's a goldfish tail. So, these are just little memory devices to help remind you of the different patterns. Can we see? Everything good? Okay, good.
How does the take this traditional art and veer away from it
Oh, yeah.
into modern?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, variations on it within realism and also complete abstraction. You know, it's a really exciting materials to work with. So, you know, you can work in all sorts of layers. You can crumple paper. You know, in some of my landscapes, I'll crumple up paper and dry brush over it for rocks and hills, and you flatten it out and work on it. Because at the end, it all gets mounted down flat anyway. So you can, within reason, abuse the paper to get an end result that suits you.
Speaking about mounting, can you describe the process that you go through to mount?
Yeah.
I took a workshop and it was beyond me.
It's a little scary. Chinese markets are on Amazon. You know, when you're mixing up, if you mix up like a cornstarch solution for thickening, right? But if you cook it on its own, it's just completely clear. Wheat paste is the same thing. You know, it has a nice glue property to it, but when you make it, it's almost just clear. So.
Those of us who are very old remember when our fathers did wallpaper, and that's how you pasted.
Exactly.
So you mount onto a separate sheet and then that gets mounted onto another sheet?
Yeah. Yep. I'll explain a little more in a moment. Finish off our bamboo here. Okay. Okay, that's it. Okay. White space, empty space is very important. It's so hard for a Westerner. You have to remember to leave some empty space. So if you're signing it, you know, maybe something discrete down here would be a nice balance. Because people were talking about the chops before, so if I'm using a small chop, this sort of as a counterpoint, visual counterpoint, these lines are so strong here, I don't want to reinforce those. I want something that's going to bring the energy sort of across from it. So briefly about seals. So there's a name seal. So my last name is Heise. 2 characters. Yeah, it's good to have Chinese friends. Heise, meaning oceans of thought, is the seal I have. But there's also a mood seal. If you want to use a mood seal, so maybe an expression that you find inspiring, you can use that. Sometimes people have a studio seal, like overlooking the Bay Studio, because I live near the Narragansett Bay. You know, that sort of thing. And so those sort of enhance the appreciation of the painting. Yeah, they're red. I don't know, good question. They're always red. There's a few variations on red, but they're always red, yeah. The seals themselves. Well, they were used as an official document, you know, during ancient times, and that's carried over into an aesthetic appreciation for paintings as well. It's part of the aesthetic of the painting. So if you place it in a bad spot, it can ruin the painting. You want to make sure it's helping to balance things out, and it works with the painting. But that's why you have several seals. Sometimes you need something big and red. Sometimes you need something small and red. You know, you need a little more or a little less. It's that kind of play. And if you're using up to 3 seals, I mean, you can use more. But if, you know, classically, you would use maybe 2 or 3. You would want them almost to create a triangle to sort of, you know, encompass that composition and to act as a counterpoint to aspects of it, or to reinforce aspects of it that need a little reinforcement. Yeah, there might be a mood seal, yeah. You know, there's great stories about some artists and their mood seals. There was one fellow in the, I think, 1950s, and he had an exhibit, and he was doing brush painting in China, and he was trying some new ideas, and a critic said, it's a big mess. That was the review, it was a big mess. So we had a seal made that said, a big mess. So, you know, I think that's terrific. So, but you can go with that. So, if I was to mount this, I've got my wheat paste mixed up, and it's kind of like a milk-like consistency. I have another piece of paper cut that's approximately 3 inches bigger all around. I have that rolled up on a tube. It makes it easier to lay out. Wheat paste goes down on the back. Wipe up the edge. Yeah, with a wipe, what they call like a raft brush. It's all those little brushes attached to each other. Right? Put all that down. And it's about the consistency of milk, or even a little thinner. You know, you don't want it too thick. Clean up the edge. Roll out the other. Then now I've got a heavy, stiff brush. Really, it's made from like bamboo leaves that you help to, you know, like you're doing wallpaper. Right? You're attaching the back. But you roll it out so that it's 3 inches bigger on all sides. Right? Now you apply a tiny bit of glue on the outer edge of that paper. Pick it up, stick it onto a plywood, right, that's vertical, and then you attach that with that brush just along that edge, as if you're using wallpaper, you know, wallpaper concept, but you're only tacking down that outer edge. When it all dries the next day, you cut it free because now you have a space in between, theoretically, that's completely dry. So the edge is glued down, and then the paper is attached to that. So you cut it free and then trim it to maybe a 1/4 inch bigger than the painting itself. And now you have, and actually the painting looks different after you mount it. With all of my students, at the end of the class, the course runs 8 weeks. You know, we do a bunch of paintings. Pick one piece, I'll mount it up for you. Because it's sort of a reward. You don't really know what the painting looks like until after it's mounted. The blacks are blacker, the colors are brighter. You see all the mistakes. But it just looks better. It's flatter, cleaner, and brighter. It's almost like you're varnishing a painting. That's really the overall effect. So.
And the purpose of that is, besides getting the colors brighter and to make it pop, is to strengthen the paper?
Yeah. Because remember, traditionally, you know, if you wanted to keep it, it would be, you know, like hung up as a hanging scroll with a silk border, or it would be a rolling scroll that you would sit and look at on the table. You know, sometimes you see those. They would, the Chinese would do long landscapes, and working right to left, you know, these scrolls might be dozens of feet long. You know, and it would be as if you're traveling through the landscape. You sit there and unroll a bit, roll up a bit, unroll a bit more. And the idea is that you're traveling through that landscape, you know.
Gary, would you have time to just talk about a couple of the landscapes?
Yeah, sure. So I was saying, so some of my work are real specific scenes. Others are inspired by. I didn't start painting bamboo until, you know, just a few months ago because it's not a native plant. I figured, why do I need to paint it as an American painter, right? But I decided I wanted to teach it, and learning to paint it teaches you a lot about painting because the brush control is not so easy doing those leaves. So different types of painting, you know, like I said, I like really immediate sort of work. This is actually a small piece I did as to warm myself up for a larger piece. A couple pine trees, or parts of them. And this, I did a bigger color version with some snow geese in it, about 27 inches square, based on this. You can really play with texture. I'll wrinkle up the paper. You can really wrinkle it up and then flatten it out somewhat, and then with dry brush, paint in some texture, either working with white or working with darker ink. And that's sort of how this was started, as a nice lonely winter landscape. I'm one of those people that loves winter. But there's all sorts of approaches. This is the monoprint version we had talked about, or approach. Here's another one. So this up here is a studio seal. This says overlooking the Bay Studio. This says painted by Heise after the age of 60. You know, it's 60, you know, it seems like official old age, so I can start dating my work. But, you know, it's quite a bold piece, this small one, so it needed a big punch of red down here. And as a counterpoint, you know, I put the studio seal up here to bring a little bit of attention to the trees up here, really.
Do you ever do the monoprint from the back? Or is it always on the first
It's up to you. There's no rules. You do whatever you like. I've done both, yeah. You know, sometimes the monoprint is a little harsh, so you work on the back. It's a little softer on the back. You know, you can take that approach. Yeah, I mean, just, you know, at that point, then you just play. What I've been showing today is quite traditional, but my own work typically, you can experiment more. Do what, you know, is important to you, what's interesting. Play around and see what happens, you know. No.
Chinese brush painter.
Yeah. Wow. Horses are hard, yeah. Wow. People will specialize. There's some people that only paint bamboo. Some people only paint horses. Yeah. Because I'm teaching. I mean, upcoming in April, I'm teaching. Well, there's a genre of painting called bird and flower. And then that also involves insects. So I'll be doing some bugs too. But I'll be learning how to paint sparrows and finches very soon for that class. But we'll be doing narcissus, wisteria, and cherry blossoms. So
how will you learn that? Will you look at the animal, or will you look at a book or something?
both, and YouTube. The plants I've done, but I need to get my skills up a little bit. The birds, you know, once you paint, once you feel like you can control the brush, you can paint anything. Doesn't matter. You know, if you can draw it, you can paint it.
How long did it take you to feel that confident brush stroke? You knew that stroke was...
You know, it was a really slow start for me because I had Mr. Liao, you know, his classes, probably a set of 8 classes. And then I couldn't find any other teachers, so I was sort of on my own for years, just playing, and my kids were little and didn't always have a lot of time, but I kept at it. But then, and I was actually, you know, always interjecting my own Western background too of painting and playing around with things. It's actually the last decade, I would say, that I put more attention to learning the real traditional stuff. Yeah. But it's a different Liao, but I have a friend, Frank Liao, who's a wonderful painter in the Lingnan School, and great painter. He teaches up in Westchester with the Asian Brush Artists Guild. And I picked him up at the train station one time, and he's a great guy. We always chat. And he says Chinese painting is 2 things, brush control and moisture control. Moisture control. Because so often it's typically people use a brush that's too wet, and it just spreads. Sometimes you want it, but then you get a little scared, and then the brush sometimes needs to be wetter. Like if you're doing petals, it's wetter. For the bamboo, the leaves need to be a little wet. The stalks need to be a little drier. That's why I'm always testing before I work. You know, some people can just tell, and you do. You know, you do learn, but to be really sure, it's good to test. So then you feel like you're in more control. But quite frankly, it's always a collaboration with the material. And you want it to have a voice. You know, if things blot a little bit, I mean, that is part of the aesthetic and appreciation of it. And again, it's the energy that you bring to it is more important than getting an exact likeness. So if you spill a little bit, you know, it's a little sloppy, a little smeary, it's okay.
When you were at RISD, what type of painting did you do?
I didn't have a lot of focus, so I just wanted to learn. So I was studying everything. I had a real love affair with like 16th century Persian miniature painting. So my thesis project in school was in gouache on paper, which went over like a lead balloon. I've always just played and kind of followed my own interest and gone down the rabbit holes and had fun. But I always had an interest in this sort of painting back then, but there were no teachers. So I took all the classes I could in Chinese and Japanese, art history, painting history, you know, whatever I could to kind of eat that up. So when I found a teacher, I had some understanding, at least, of the history of it and the aesthetic of it and the philosophy of it. You know, and that's never quit. And quite frankly, after Mr. Liao Xiaoping's classes, after RISD, I haven't picked up oil paint since. I would love to get back into it, and I may, but You know, I love the flatness of the aesthetic. You know, it's very flat, it's very graphic, the colors are bright, it's very simple, it's very direct. It really suits my personality and the way that I like to work. So for me, it was a great match. You know. It feels like home. You know, when I pick up a brush, it feels like I'm ready to work. Thank you, everyone.